Most brides worry about rain on their wedding day. Hannah Whitaker watched her parents walk into her reception dressed in solid black, as if they had mistaken the barn for a funeral home. The June sunlight was still glowing through the wide wooden doors, catching on white tablecloths and strings of warm lights overhead. Guests had just settled in after the ceremony when the three of them entered together: Patricia in a long black dress, Thomas in a dark suit and black tie, and Savannah in a fitted black cocktail dress that stood in stark contrast to the pale summer colors around her. 150 heads turned in slow confusion. The whispering started before Patricia reached the stage. She did not wait to be invited. She crossed the dance floor with deliberate steps and gently but firmly removed the microphone from the DJ's hand. The music faded. Glasses stopped clinking. Caleb Rowan, still standing beside his bride, tightened his hold on Hannah's fingers. Patricia faced the room first, then her daughter. Her voice carried clearly through the speakers. "We are mourning the daughter we lost today." The words landed with a dull, stunned silence. Hannah felt the air leave her lungs. 30 minutes earlier, she had promised to build a life with the man beside her. Now her own mother was turning her wedding into a public accusation. What Patricia said next made Hannah's hands tremble. But what Caleb did after that would change the direction of the night, and the course of every relationship in that room. Before I continue, I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has subscribed and supported this channel. It truly means more than you know. If you haven't subscribed yet, please take a second to do so. It's completely free, and it helps the channel grow. Like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. To understand how it came to this moment, the story had started 18 months earlier with a check. Hannah grew up in a small Tennessee town with one traffic light and a church parking lot that functioned as both social hub and rumor exchange. In the Whitaker household, there were two daughters, but only one who was truly celebrated. Savannah had the kind of presence that drew attention without effort: bright smile, easy laughter, quick wit. At school events and church gatherings, Patricia and Thomas stood straighter when she walked into the room. Hannah was different. She was quiet, methodical, steady. She earned strong grades, worked part-time at a farm supply store from the age of 16, and helped manage the house whenever her parents were busy attending Savannah's rehearsals, pageants, or social events. Their refrigerator reflected the imbalance clearly. Photographs of Savannah's dance competitions, awards, and smiling portraits filled most of the space. Hannah's accomplishments rarely made it there. At 17, she once taped her honor roll certificate at eye level. By morning it had been removed and folded neatly into a drawer. No one mentioned it. She did not bring it up either. Silence had become easier than confrontation. Patricia often framed the difference as personality. "Savannah shines in the spotlight," she would say during family dinners. "Hannah is more behind the scenes." The comment sounded kind enough to outsiders. Hannah learned to accept it as explanation rather than dismissal. Over time, she stopped expecting recognition. She focused instead on work, saving money carefully and avoiding unnecessary spending. Independence, she decided early, was safer than waiting to be chosen. That habit of quiet saving would later shape everything. At 27, Hannah was living in a modest apartment across town and working double shifts as a veterinary technician at the county animal clinic. She liked the work. Animals responded to care without politics or favoritism. They either trusted you or they did not. One Tuesday evening, Patricia called with urgency in her voice. "We need you to come by. It's serious." The Whitaker house had aged badly. The roof leaked in multiple places, sections of the foundation were cracking, and the plumbing, original from the late 70s, had begun failing. Thomas's pension and Patricia's part-time bookkeeping barely covered monthly expenses. Full structural repairs would require more than they had. Savannah was absent from the family meeting that followed. She sent a brief message saying she was busy and would support whatever decision makes sense. Hannah listened quietly while her parents described estimates from contractors. She had spent 10 years building savings through careful budgeting and consistent overtime shifts. She knew exactly what sat in her account. Within a week, she handed her parents a cashier's check totaling $85,000. The final renovation costs would later reach $85,247, which she paid directly to the contractor, Darren Holt, through documented transfers over 4 months. She kept copies of every invoice and confirmation email, not out of suspicion but habit. When the renovations were complete, new roof, reinforced foundation, updated plumbing, and fresh paint, the house looked renewed. On the front porch, Patricia hugged her. "This home will always be yours," she said. Thomas nodded in agreement. There was no written agreement. No deed change. Only trust exchanged across a kitchen table. Hannah believed it. 3 months after construction ended, a minor exterior issue required repair. Darren Holt's crew had missed a section along the back porch. That was when Hannah met Caleb Rowan. He arrived in a weathered pickup truck and introduced himself without excess words. His handshake was firm, his tone direct. He examined the damage carefully before giving an estimate that was reasonable and transparent. He completed the repair in a single afternoon. Hannah brought him iced tea while he packed his tools. They sat on the tailgate of his truck as the sun dipped behind the trees. The silence between them felt steady rather than awkward. They began seeing each other 2 weeks later. When Caleb visited the Whitaker home for dinner, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Patricia studied him with subtle scrutiny, his calloused hands, his practical clothing, the modest truck parked outside. "What line of work are you in?" she asked. "Residential contracting," Caleb replied calmly. "Mostly renovation and structural repairs." Patricia offered a polite nod that carried reservation rather than approval. Savannah was visiting that evening as well. She was friendly to Caleb's face, asking about projects and joking lightly. Later, through the thin walls of Hannah's childhood bedroom, Hannah overheard Savannah speaking quietly on the phone. "He seems fine," Savannah said. "But I'm not sure he's the right fit long term." The comment was mild, but the tone held judgment. Caleb never heard it. Hannah did not repeat it. For the first time in years, she felt chosen, not compared. 6 months after the renovation, Hannah stopped by the Whitaker house to retrieve stored belongings from her old bedroom. The door was unlocked. When she stepped inside, she paused. Her former room had been repainted a soft lavender. A vanity table replaced her desk. Decorative pillows matched new curtains. The closet was empty. Her belongings, yearbooks, framed photos, childhood keepsakes, had been packed into plastic bins and moved to the garage. "Savannah needs a space when she visits," Patricia said casually from the kitchen. "You live across town now." The shift was presented as practical. It did not feel that way. Later that afternoon, Hannah asked gently about the earlier promise regarding the house. Thomas stood in the doorway holding a coffee mug but said nothing. "We'll discuss those details in time," Patricia replied. "There's no need to complicate things." Hannah drove home unsettled. When she told Caleb what had happened, he listened carefully without interruption. "Do you have records of the payments?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Every transfer. Every invoice." "Good. Keep them organized. Just in case." His tone was not alarmist. It was measured. That evening, he began helping her compile digital copies of everything into a secure folder. He did not accuse her parents. He did not speculate. He simply prepared. And preparation would soon matter more than anyone in that house expected. Caleb proposed on a quiet Sunday morning in Hannah's small apartment kitchen. There was no elaborate setup, no photographer hiding behind a curtain. He simply placed 2 mugs of coffee on the counter and said, "I want to build something permanent with you. Not just houses. A life." She said yes before he finished the sentence. When Hannah called Patricia later that day, the reaction was measured rather than warm. "That's sooner than I expected," her mother replied after a brief silence. "But if you're certain, then we'll see how things unfold." There was no offer to help plan the wedding. No questions about dates or venues. Within a week, Savannah returned to town unexpectedly. She spent several days shopping with Patricia and posting photos online. Boutique visits, dress fittings, smiling captions that implied celebration without specifying whose. Hannah was not invited to any of the outings. 2 days later, a receptionist from the animal clinic quietly mentioned overhearing something at the local salon. "They are saying Caleb might have encouraged you to invest in your parents' house," the woman said gently. "Like he had an interest in it." Hannah went still. The rumor was subtle but damaging. It painted Caleb as opportunistic and Hannah as manipulated. That evening, she told Caleb exactly what she had heard. He did not react emotionally. "Rumors spread fast in small towns," he said. "Facts move slower. That's why we keep documentation." It was the first time she understood that someone was actively shaping a narrative, and that it was not accidental. 2 weeks later, Patricia called again, her tone sharper than before. "Your father and I have been discussing the future of the house," she began. "Savannah may need it more than you. She's considering relocating and could use stability." Hannah felt her pulse rise but kept her voice steady. "I invested $85,247 into that renovation," she replied clearly. It was understood the house would eventually be mine. That contribution was a gift to help your parents, Patricia answered. We never signed anything. Thomas did not speak during the call. His silence filled the background. After hanging up, Hannah sat at the kitchen table reviewing the transaction records again. Each transfer to Darren Holt's company was time-stamped and confirmed. Every invoice listed the scope of work. The total matched precisely, $85,247. Caleb pulled up a chair beside her. We need to prepare for the possibility they try to formalize something without your consent, he said calmly. Property transfers require documentation. They cannot legally remove your financial contribution from existence. The next day, Caleb scheduled a consultation with a real estate attorney in Cookville named Robert Callahan. It was not a lawsuit. It was an informational meeting. Callahan reviewed the documentation and spoke plainly. If you contributed significant funds under the reasonable expectation of ownership, and that promise is withdrawn, Tennessee courts recognize unjust enrichment claims, he explained. Your records are thorough. That matters. Hannah did not want a legal fight. But she understood now that preparation was not hostility. It was protection. 3 weeks before the wedding, Hannah drove to her parents' house to retrieve a final box of stored belongings. Savannah's car was parked in the driveway. Hannah hesitated briefly before entering through the side garage door. As she lifted a box into her trunk, voices drifted from an upstairs window left slightly open. Savannah was on speakerphone. Once it's in my name, I'll list it immediately, she said, laughing lightly. We checked comparable sales. $450,000 is realistic. A male voice responded faintly. Your parents don't suspect anything. They believe Caleb pushed her to invest, Savannah replied. That part was easy. Hannah stood motionless. The conversation continued for several seconds before she quietly stepped back into her car and left without confrontation. That evening, she described every word to Caleb. He listened carefully. Did you record it? He asked. No. That's all right, he replied. People who manipulate stories usually repeat themselves in writing. They leave digital trails. 2 days later, an unexpected development occurred. Brandon Keene, Savannah's boyfriend, contacted Caleb directly. He had heard about the wedding tension through mutual acquaintances and wanted distance from the escalating situation. During that conversation, he forwarded screenshots of text messages Savannah had sent him discussing her plan to claim and sell the property. Caleb saved the files without comment. Evidence, when preserved correctly, speaks without raising its voice. 1 week before the wedding, Savannah arrived at Hannah's apartment unannounced. She carried a single sheet of paper and an envelope. It's just to clear up misunderstandings, Savannah said, placing the document on the table. The header read, Acknowledgement of Gift. The language was concise. It stated that Hannah's $85,247 contribution toward the Whitaker home renovation was a voluntary gift made without expectation of repayment or ownership interest. Hannah read it carefully. I'm not signing this, she said evenly. Savannah's smile faltered briefly before returning. It's just for peace of mind. Mom's nervous about the wedding. Then she shouldn't have created reasons to be, Hannah replied. Savannah left without further argument, though the unsigned document remained on the table. Caleb photographed it immediately and placed the physical copy into a folder containing the bank statements, contractor invoices, and recently received text screenshots. The legal timeline was now clear. If the house were transferred to Savannah through a quitclaim deed, Hannah would have documented proof that her contribution had not been a gift. The existence of the acknowledgement form itself demonstrated awareness of potential liability. Caleb closed the folder. If anyone tries to create a public narrative, he said quietly, we'll respond with facts. The wedding remained scheduled for June 14th. The ceremony took place under a large oak tree on a restored barn property 20 minutes outside town. The weather was clear. White chairs lined the grass. Friends from the clinic, members of Caleb's construction crew, and extended relatives filled the rows. When Hannah walked toward the altar, Caleb's expression softened visibly. The vows were simple and sincere. During his, Caleb added one unscripted line. I will protect what we build together. It was understated but deliberate. Applause followed the kiss. Guests moved toward the barn for the reception. Laughter returned. For a brief window, the day felt uncomplicated. Then a silver sedan pulled into the gravel lot. Patricia exited first, dressed entirely in black. Thomas followed in a matching suit. Savannah stepped out last, wearing dark heels and sunglasses pushed onto her head. The visual contrast against summer dresses and pastel shirts was immediate. They took seats in the front row without greeting anyone. Hannah noticed the shift in whispers. Caleb noticed her tightening grip. The ceremony concluded without disruption. But tension settled heavily in the air as guests moved indoors. When the DJ invited family members to offer toasts, Patricia rose from her chair and walked toward the microphone before anyone could intervene. The reception, which had begun in celebration, was about to change direction. Patricia did not raise her voice when she reached the microphone. She didn't need to. The room quieted out of instinct. "We are grieving tonight," she began. "We are losing our daughter to a man who has divided this family." A ripple moved through the tables. Hannah felt heat rise in her face but remained seated. Patricia continued. "If there is still respect for the home that raised you, then this ends now. Sign the document acknowledging your financial contribution as a gift, and we can move forward." Savannah stood and walked calmly toward the head table. She placed the same acknowledgement form in front of Hannah, along with a pen. Thomas rose from his seat but did not speak. Silence settled heavily across the barn. Guests looked from the paper to the bride, uncertain how to react. Hannah did not reach for the pen. Caleb stood slowly. He buttoned his jacket once, a habitual motion. Without addressing Patricia directly, he walked toward the DJ booth where a laptop connected to the projector had been cycling wedding photos. He exchanged a brief word with the DJ, then picked up the remote. "Before anything else," he said evenly, "let's look at the full picture." The screen went dark. Then it lit up with a scanned bank statement. The projection showed a highlighted transfer dated 22 months earlier. The amount was clearly visible, $85,000 wired to Holt Construction. Beneath it, subsequent transfers totaling $247 completed the full renovation cost of $85,247. Caleb did not elaborate. He pressed the remote again. The next slide displayed email correspondence between Hannah and Darren Holt. Invoices detailed roof replacement, foundation stabilization, plumbing overhaul, and exterior repairs. Each invoice was marked paid in full by Hannah Whitaker. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Another click revealed before and after photographs of the Whitaker home. Each image included timestamps and contractor documentation. Caleb allowed a pause before advancing to the next slide. The acknowledgement form appeared on the screen, clearly photographed earlier that week. Its wording requesting confirmation that the funds were a voluntary gift was legible. Then the final slide appeared. Text message screenshots between Savannah and Brandon Keene filled the screen. The messages were timestamped. "Once it's transferred, I'm listing it immediately. Mom and Dad think Caleb pushed her into investing. They believed it without question. She'll never own it anyway." A collective intake of breath swept through the barn. Caleb lowered the remote. "These messages were forwarded to me directly," he said calmly. "No one manipulated them. They are complete." Savannah's composure fractured visibly. Patricia's grip on the microphone loosened. Facts had replaced accusation. For several seconds, no one spoke. Thomas was the first to move. He looked at the screen, then at Savannah, then at Hannah. His expression shifted from confusion to recognition. "Is this accurate?" he asked quietly. Savannah opened her mouth but did not produce a response. The silence answered for her. Patricia stepped back from the microphone. The posture she had carried into the room, upright, certain, diminished under the weight of public evidence. Guests began speaking softly among themselves. No one shouted. No one applauded. The reaction was subdued but unmistakable. Savannah retrieved her bag abruptly and headed toward the exit. Her steps were quick, uneven against the wooden floor. Patricia followed shortly after. Thomas hesitated only a moment before turning as well. The barn doors opened. Night air moved through the room. Within seconds, the car engine started and the vehicle pulled away. Caleb returned to the table and sat beside Hannah. He did not comment on what had just occurred. He simply reached for her hand under the tablecloth. The DJ cleared his throat carefully. "Bar's still open," he said, attempting normalcy. A few nervous laughs followed, then more. Gradually, conversation resumed. The wedding continued, not as originally imagined, but intact. The following morning, Hannah and Caleb drove to Cookville to meet with Robert Callahan. The attorney reviewed the complete documentation, bank transfers, contractor invoices, acknowledgement form, and text screenshots. "This is straightforward," Callahan said after several minutes. "You contributed substantial funds under a reasonable expectation of future ownership. attempting to reclassify that contribution retroactively as a gift creates exposure. If they refuse repayment, we file for unjust enrichment. I don't want their house, Hannah clarified. I want my money returned.
Callahan nodded.
That simplifies matters. A formal demand letter was drafted within 48 hours. It outlined the documented contributions and requested repayment of $85,247. It also noted that the acknowledgement document demonstrated awareness that the funds were not originally considered a gift. The letter was sent via certified mail. 8 days later, Patricia called Hannah. You involve an attorney, she said, voice tight. Yes, Hannah replied evenly. I protected my investment.
Thomas did not speak during that call either.
6 weeks after the filing of the formal claim, Callahan notified Hannah that her parents had agreed to settle. Repayment would occur over 36 months in equal installments, secured by a lien against the property until satisfied. The house would remain in her parents' names. The objective was restitution, not possession.
News traveled quickly through town.
The slideshow had been witnessed by many, and those who had not attended heard about it within days. Savannah's real estate brokerage reviewed the situation carefully. Professional credibility depended on trust. Within a month, she was no longer employed there. Brandon Keene distanced himself as well. According to mutual acquaintances, he preferred not to be associated with public disputes involving property or litigation.
The relationship ended quietly.
Patricia withdrew from church activities for several weeks. Thomas spent more time tending the garden behind the Whitaker home. Conversations in town shifted subtly, polite but measured.
Hannah did not post about the incident online. She did not comment publicly.
She allowed the legal agreement to proceed through Callahan's office. The first repayment installment arrived on schedule. One evening, as they reviewed the deposit confirmation, Caleb looked across the kitchen table at her. You didn't raise your voice, he said. You just showed the truth.
Hannah nodded.
Love is a feeling, she replied thoughtfully. Trust requires terms. Caleb reached for her hand. The wedding had not ended the way she imagined, but it had clarified more than it damaged. The future would now be built on documented ground. The first repayment installment cleared Hannah's account on a quiet Thursday afternoon. She stared at the deposit notification longer than she expected. It was not satisfaction she felt, but steadiness. The agreement was no longer theoretical. It was active. The settlement required equal monthly payments over 36 months, secured by a lien filed through Robert Callahan's office. The arrangement protected her without forcing confrontation.
All communication moved through legal channels.
There were no personal negotiations, no emotional appeals.
Thomas began calling every other Sunday.
The conversations were brief and practical.
How's work at the clinic? He would ask. Busy, Hannah would answer.
And Caleb? He's doing well. The calls rarely lasted more than 5 minutes, but they were consistent. Thomas never mentioned the wedding directly. He did not attempt to justify what had happened. The silence carried regret, though he struggled to name it.
Patricia did not call. Hannah did not pursue contact. She had drawn a boundary and was learning to respect it herself.
The absence of conflict felt unfamiliar at first. For years, tension had been background noise.
Now there was space where noise used to be.
Caleb noticed the difference before she did. You're sleeping better, he observed one night as they locked up the house.
She realized he was right.
The uncertainty that once followed every family interaction had been replaced with clarity. It did not erase disappointment, but it reduced its power. For the first time, Hannah understood that resolution does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in scheduled deposits and short phone calls that do not spiral into argument. By late summer, Savannah had relocated to Nashville.
The move was quick and unceremonious.
There was no farewell dinner, no formal announcement. Word spread through acquaintances rather than direct communication. Hannah learned about it during one of Thomas's brief Sunday calls. She found an apartment closer to the city, he said.
Thought it was best. Hannah did not ask for details. Savannah did not reach out.
There were no apologies, no attempts to revisit the events of the wedding. The connection between the sisters had thinned gradually over years. The confrontation merely confirmed what had already eroded. In town, conversations adjusted accordingly. People were polite when Hannah passed through the grocery store or post office. No one brought up the slideshow directly, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement that the narrative had shifted.
Patricia eventually returned to church services. She sat several rows back instead of her usual front pew. The change was subtle but noticeable. Social roles recalibrate quietly in small communities. Hannah observed all of this from a distance.
She no longer felt compelled to defend herself or correct rumors. The legal agreement spoke sufficiently. At home, Caleb began browsing property listings beyond town limits. They had discussed buying a place of their own once the settlement began. With the first few payments received and savings intact, the plan felt attainable. What if we start fresh somewhere that isn't layered with history?
Caleb suggested one evening. Hannah considered the idea carefully.
A new space would not erase the past, but it could provide neutrality. For the first time, the possibility felt less like escape and more like intention.
They found the house in early September.
It sat on the edge of the county line, modest and slightly neglected, with overgrown shrubs and a porch that leaned just enough to suggest future work.
The structure was sound. Caleb saw potential immediately.
It has good bones, he said, walking the perimeter with measured steps. Cosmetic work mostly.
The asking price was reasonable.
With part of the settlement already paid and their savings carefully maintained, they were able to make an offer without stretching beyond comfort. The purchase contract listed both names clearly, Hannah Whitaker Rowan and Caleb Rowan. At closing, Hannah signed documents that were precise and enforceable. Every page was explained. Every term was reviewed. Ownership was not implied, it was documented. Caleb began renovations the following week. Evenings and weekends were spent replacing flooring, repairing trim, updating fixtures. Hannah planted herbs along the fence line and painted interior walls in neutral tones. The work was steady and unhurried. Tessa Moore visited most Saturdays, bringing takeout and commentary. "It feels different here," Tessa observed one afternoon, leaning against the porch railing.
"It is," Hannah replied.
"There's no history attached." The house gradually transformed under consistent effort. It was not extravagant, but it was theirs. Each improvement felt intentional rather than reactive. When the second and third settlement payments arrived, Hannah directed them toward long-term savings rather than renovation. The legal process had reinforced a simple lesson: security grows from structure. This time, she built from documented ground. In October, a birthday card arrived in the mailbox with no return address, though the handwriting was familiar. Thomas had always written in careful, measured script.
Inside the card were a few simple words. "Happy birthday. Proud of you."
There was no elaboration. No reference to the wedding or the legal agreement.
Just acknowledgement.
Hannah sat at the kitchen table for several minutes before responding.
She did not draft a long message. She simply sent a text. "Thank you. I hope you're well."
Thomas replied shortly after. "I am.
I'm glad you are too."
The exchange did not resolve everything.
It did not need to. It represented movement.
That evening, Hannah placed the birthday card in the center of their refrigerator, secured with a magnet. The gesture was small but deliberate.
Caleb noticed. "Feels right there?" he asked.
"Yes," she said. The refrigerator in this house did not display comparison.
It displayed what they chose.
There were no photographs of competition or ranking. Only grocery lists, renovation schedules, and a single birthday card. Hannah understood now that reconciliation does not always require full restoration. Sometimes it begins with modest acknowledgement and grows slowly, if at all.
She was no longer waiting for validation. She was participating in boundaries.
That distinction changed everything. As autumn settled in, Thomas asked if he could visit one Sunday afternoon. He arrived with a store-bought pie and an expression that suggested hesitation.
Caleb opened the door first.
"Good to see you," Caleb said simply, stepping aside. Thomas stepped inside cautiously, as though entering unfamiliar territory. He complimented the new flooring, examined the porch railing, and asked about renovation plans.
Caleb answered without guardedness.
Over dinner, conversation remained practical: gardening, local news, clinic work. There were no references to the wedding. When Thomas prepared to leave, he paused at the doorway. "I should have spoken up that night," he said quietly.
Hannah met his eyes.
"Yes," she replied evenly. The acknowledgement was neither harsh nor forgiving.
It was factual.
Thomas nodded once. "I'm working on doing better."
She believed him.
After he left, Caleb locked the door and returned to the kitchen.
"You handled that well," he said. "I didn't need to win anything," Hannah answered.
"I just needed clarity." The visit did not erase the past, but it established new expectations. Thomas understood that silence would no longer be mistaken for agreement. Boundaries had been defined not through shouting but through consistency. That evening, Hannah felt a steady calm rather than lingering anger. Progress, she realized, is often quiet. Winter approached with fewer complications than the year had begun. Settlement payments continued without interruption. Robert Callahan's office monitored compliance, ensuring documentation remained current. Savannah did not contact Hannah during that time. Mutual acquaintances occasionally mentioned she was adjusting to life in Nashville.
Hannah neither sought nor avoided updates.
At the clinic, daily routines resumed their ordinary rhythm. Animals required treatment regardless of family disputes. Work grounded her. One afternoon, Tessa asked directly, "Do you regret how it unfolded?"
Hannah considered the question carefully. "I regret that it had to be public," she said.
"But I don't regret protecting myself."
The distinction mattered.
She no longer replayed the reception scene at night. The memory remained, but it had shifted from humiliation to turning point. Caleb's role in that shift was undeniable.
He had not escalated conflict.
He had prepared quietly, responded proportionately, and allowed evidence to speak. "You don't need to shout to be heard," he had told her once while organizing paperwork. "You just need the truth organized."
That approach had reshaped more than a single event.
It had redefined how Hannah understood strength. The year that began with accusation was ending with documented resolution. And the difference between those two states was preparation. By early spring, the house on the county line felt settled. The porch no longer leaned. The garden produced herbs and early vegetables. Inside, the walls held no echo of previous arguments. Hannah reviewed the settlement ledger occasionally, not out of anxiety but awareness. Each payment reduced the remaining balance predictably. The structure of the agreement allowed her to move forward without revisiting old conversations. One evening, she stood in the doorway watching Caleb repair a section of fence. "You know," she said, "I used to think trust meant not asking for proof." Caleb straightened and wiped his hands on a rag. "Trust isn't the absence of proof," he replied. "It's the presence of reliability."
She nodded.
The lesson had cost $85,247 and a public confrontation, but it had also clarified her expectations permanently. She no longer confused affection with accountability.
She no longer mistook silence for peace.
When she thought about the wedding now, she did not focus on the accusation. She remembered the moment Caleb pressed the remote and replaced uncertainty with evidence.
That moment marked a shift from reaction to intention.
And intention, she had learned, sustains more effectively than emotion. A year after the wedding, Hannah stood on her own porch at dusk, watching the light fade across the yard they had rebuilt together. The air carried the quiet sounds of early evening, distant traffic, a dog barking, wind through the trees. The settlement balance had reduced steadily. The lien remained in place as agreed. The legal structure continued to function without drama.
Thomas still called every other Sunday.
The conversations were no longer strained. They were measured, occasionally even warm. Patricia had not yet reached out directly, but Hannah no longer waited for that call to define her stability.
Savannah remained in Nashville. Their relationship existed now only as memory.
Caleb stepped onto the porch beside her and leaned against the railing.
"You all right?" he asked.
"Yes," she answered without hesitation. She understood that peace did not come from restoring every relationship.
It came from knowing where responsibility ended. The house behind her carried both names on the deed.
The future in front of her carried both effort and clarity. The wedding day had begun with accusation and ended with evidence. The months that followed replaced assumption with structure. Hannah no longer measured belonging by approval. She measured it by agreement, action, and consistency. As the last light disappeared beyond the trees, she felt neither anger nor triumph. Only certainty. And certainty, she knew now, was enough. Thank you for watching until the end.
What happened at that wedding wasn't just about money. It was about proof.
About what happens when quiet preparation meets public accusation.
Hannah didn't destroy her family that night.
She simply refused to let herself be erased. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself, you already know how heavy that decision can be. And sometimes, choosing yourself is the bravest move in the room.
I'll see you in the next one.